Good afternoon, Internet. Today we're going to talk about two different setups. These are the 6S setups that I'm using. One of them has KISS 32 amps and one of them has a KISS 4-in-1, which is actually a 25 amp ESC. So I'm going to take these apart and kind of show you exactly what is in them so that you can get a better understanding of what it actually takes to run 6S, which isn't that much if you already have gear that's fairly capable of running 6S. So for example, if you have a cat that comes in here and interrupts everything and puts his tail right in front of the camera, then it's, it's all good, but he can chill. So we're talking about 6S stuff, and like I said, one of them is a 32 amp setup. So this is KISS V2 32 amp ESCs with the KISS V2 flight controller on the Mr. Steele Alien with the PDB that I have, the Mr. Steele PDB, then a 5-volt Unify, and all the typical things that I run. What? This is Scully. He likes to come in and interrupt things sometimes, especially when you haven't seen him all night and he's freaking out. Bro. Okay, so let's get back to it. There are two setups here. Both of them are identical aside from the ESC setup. And like I said, one of them is running 32 amp ESCs, and this is just the original prototype, what I ended up started to fly 6S on because I knew it was capable of it. And then this setup is actually something that I was given before it actually came out, and this is the KISS 4-in-1 25 amp ESC. So they do make individual ESCs that are 25 amp that are supposed to be version 2 style that can handle D-Shot 2400, but they are also smaller than the KISS 32 amps because everyone was complaining about the size and it not fitting on their rig. So they made it a 4-in-1, sorry, not an all-in-one, a 4-in-1 that the V2 flight controller goes on, and then you have 4 ESCs. Hey! So anyways, a 4-in-1, so you have 4 25 amp ESCs all on one board, and you have your power cable attached to that. And yeah, I'll kind of give you some pros and cons of both as we go over them and why you might run one versus the other, because there are a couple things that one can offer that the other one can't, and vice versa. And there's a little bit of a tuning difference between the two as well. So yeah, let's go ahead and look into these. I will pull them apart and we will adjust camera angle so that you can see. Let's do that. Alright, so we have this one apart. This is the 32 amp ESC setup. So again, these are all individual ESCs. This is not one 4-in-1, which I'll show you here in a second. I just kind of wanted to give you an overview of this and how it looks. So we have 4 32 amp ESCs on the arms. Underneath here is actually soldered directly to the PDB with your power, ground, and then the 3 signal wires. And then actually right here, which is really the only distinguishing factor between this and a 4S rig, is really the fact that I have capacitors on here. These are 470 microfarad 35 amp electrolytic low ESR capacitors, and these are just something that I ended up asking Schizo if he had any caps, and he gave me some. They're just generic. I don't think they're anything special. I talked to Felix that made these ESCs, the guy, Felix Neeson, the guy that actually does all the flight controllers and hardware and stuff for this and the software for KISS, and he specified that I should probably run some kind of capacitor, 35 amp to 50 or 35 volt to 50 volt, and something a little bit over 270 microfarad. So 470s worked, and I just have them taped down because the way that I have them set up, this was kind of like, again, a prototype setup, and I did this stuff without specifically designing everything for it. So these were just kind of precariously soldered on there. So I taped them down so that they don't pop up in a crash and get taken out by propellers and whatnot. So that is the 32 amp ESC setup, and again, nothing is different than the 4S setup other than the capacitors and of course the tune and the motors. So we have a lower kV motor. This is a 1700 kV motor, and then we have the capacitors, and that is literally the only difference between this and a 4S rig of the same exact equipment. Now let's go ahead and take apart the 4-in-1 setup, and I'll show you that, and I'll show you why I prefer the 4-in-1 setup. But let's go ahead and take that apart and look at that. So let's go ahead and zoom back in and I'll talk to you about this 4-in-1 setup. So now this looks a little more complex, but it's actually a lot more simplified than the 4 ESC setup. There's nothing actually super special about the 4-in-1 setup aside from the fact that I'm looking towards the future and deleting the PDB eventually. So again, when we were talking about this setup right here, which was the 4 ESC setup, everything hooks up exactly the same as the previous build. So everything is like the 4S setup. All the wires solder are not, they all solder up the exact same, and the plugs plug in the exact same. Again, if you don't already know, please refer to the diagram to plug in these plugs from the flight controller to the PDB. If you plug them in backwards, it will. Unfortunately, these were not designed for KISS 32 amps and KISS V2, and it ends up killing everything. So, you know, just refer back when you're plugging these cables in. Just make sure you're 100% right. That is kind of crucial. That is the only thing that's different. Like I said, 4 ESCs all hooked up to the PDB as it was designed to be used with 4 individual ESCs, because at the time I didn't think 4-in-1s were capable or, you know, well thought out enough and reliable enough to be able to be used. So I still liked individual ESCs. Yeah, and there wasn't a KISS 4-in-1 that was capable of doing what I wanted it to do, and I really like the feel of KISS. I know that's a personal preference, and I've always liked KISS. Ever since the 18 amps came out, I have literally tried other things, and KISS has always had the best center stick feel, and it's just my personal preference. Again, it is like choosing a car manufacturer. What car manufacturer do you prefer? Well, whatever fits your needs and whatever you think is cool. I personally think KISS does everything I need it to do and feels the way that I want a quad to feel. So if you have any questions about why I fly KISS or why I might not try Betaflight or Raceflight or anything else, Butterflight, that is the reason. KISS makes the best hardware in my opinion. They have the best person programming and making this hardware, which is Felix, and they are the ones that do a lot of innovation in this industry. Personal opinion again. So yeah, that's why I use it, and that's why I didn't do a 4-in-1 or all-in-one setup before. They don't make an all-in-one, so an all-in-one would be a flight controller integrated into the 4 ESC setups. I do think 4-in-1s are better than all-in-ones, just because you're isolating the flight controller and the gyro and everything that is on the actual flight controller. Electronically, you're isolating it from all of this current and noise that's going on inside the 4-in-1 or whatever. If you had an all-in-one, that would be why I would say go with a 4-in-1 or individual ESCs over an all-in-one, which would again encompass the flight controller and the ESCs all into one board, versus having a flight controller, which is a separate board, and having a 4-in-1, which is 4 ESCs in one, because we do need 4 ESCs to power 4 motors, because we are running a quadcopter here. So let me kind of go over this, and I'll take this apart a little bit so that you can see exactly what's going on. So why are there wires here? Well, this particular 4-in-1 doesn't actually power the flight controller, so I had to run power from the PDB to, or from where I soldered on to the flight control, or the 4-in-1 to the flight controller to power. And again, the KISS FC does take up to 6S, and obviously it works because I haven't had any issues with it. It takes 2 to 6S from the LiPo and can filter it and power the FC itself off of that power. There have been a few discussions about me running these little spacers here and why I run them, and is it quote-unquote soft mounting the flight controller. And in reality, the beginning and why I started using these spacers, and it's kind of just become a habit of mine, it's not to soft mount the ESCs or soft mount the flight controller, it's actually to space the flight controller up. And then I also put them on the top so that when you tighten down on those nylon lock nuts, they don't actually unscrew, because you have some kind of, you know, pressure from the tension caused by this squishy flex fuel, or this is like a fuel material, fuel tubing material. It's a silicone. So when you push down on it with those nylon lock nuts, it actually kind of creates some tension and doesn't allow those nylon lock nuts to come off. And that's why I've always done that. It's not to soft mount. It is literally to cause tension. Sorry, I lost one of those little things. Let me get that over here so I don't forget that. Now, this is kind of the crucial setup that people have been asking, and they're like, yo, what are you plugging in where, and how does it plug in? Okay, well, so out of the KISS flight controller, I showed you the diagram for when you're talking about 4 individual ESCs, but when you're talking about one flight controller going to a 4-in-1, then the wiring diagram is different when you're talking about running it to the Steele PDB. Again, this PDB is not designed for this setup, so you're not actually going to shave any weight by going with a 4-in-1. The advantage of going with a 4-in-1 right now is the fact that you don't have to run external capacitors. As you see, there are no capacitors whatsoever on this entire build, and that is because you can run the 4-in-1, which gives you the ability to not have to run Scully capacitors. Let me take these off and show you exactly what pins and plugs I have plugged in where and how I have this set up. This is a little bit custom. You're not going to be able to run the same bolts that you run on the Mr. Steele PDB as far as the bottom is concerned. There is a little, I had to run longer screws to run up to these standoffs so that it would enable, or shorter screws. It's kind of a standoff situation here. You have to find standoffs that fit and make it work, and yeah, it's not exactly something that's just like it's been done many times and it's a turnkey and you have all the right hardware. You might have to modify and get some hardware. So I don't think I'm going to be able to take this all the way off without taking motors off and getting to it. So you're going to have to kind of take my word for it as far as what plug I'm plugging into. So again, this is a KISS V2 flight controller. This is the KISS 25 amp 4-in-1 ESC, and we have a wire coming out of port the one that says PDB on the FC itself actually goes to the 4-in-1, and there's only one plug on the 4-in-1, so you can't really mess that up. So you have PDB from the flight controller going to the 4-in-1. And then that is literally just a straight over wires, like these wires are straight across. There's no twists, there's no weird things involving that whatsoever. And then you have the other one that says serial 1, whatever you want to call it. And serial 1 actually comes out of the flight controller and goes to the port 2. So if you can see, you probably can't, but it goes to port 2. Which, if you're looking at the quad from the back, it's the one on the right. So again, for you guys, if you're looking at the quad from the back, it's the one on your right, my left, port 2. So again, serial 1 goes to port 2, and this is the wire that comes with the 4-in-1, so it's a longer wire. It's got the exact same layout as far as the pins are concerned. They come straight out, they go straight in to whatever the other side of the plug is, and then, yeah, port 2, and then port 1 is actually not used. So, and this will enable you to run the OSD and have all the current and telemetry features that you could get out of the OSD with the 4-in-1. And that was kind of my huge thing, was I wanted to be able to utilize the OSD from my PDB on the 4-in-1. I didn't know if it was possible. I ended up figuring it out and back and forth with Felix, and then kind of just plugging things in and figuring it out on my own, hopefully not frying things. I didn't fry anything, and it ended up working out. Now, this does actually kind of negate all of the solder joints on the PDB. There is nothing actually soldered to the PDB anymore, and again, well, other than your video transmitter and your camera, those are the only things that are soldered on there. Your ESCs are not actually soldered on there anymore. There's no power lead anymore. This power lead comes directly into the 4-in-1. The 4-in-1 is actually powering all of the motors and ESCs and everything. You have the 4-in-1 ESC, which is actually powering the flight controller via an external plug. And again, this is kind of a band-aid patch fix for something that wasn't designed to do this. I am currently working on something that is a little bit different that will integrate this a little bit better. But for now, those of you that wanted to try a 4-in-1 and they wanted to try it on this Mr. Steele Alien, like their current setup, this is exactly how you would run it. So I'll kind of go through a generic run through of the whole thing so you can understand what exactly is going to happen. So you're going to take everything apart. You're going to unsolder all 4 ESCs. On another build, I ended up like wicking off the extra solder, you know, whatever, weight reduction. And you're going to actually take everything off the PDB. There's nothing going to be left except the solder joints for your flight or for your transmitter, your video transmitter, and your camera. Those are the only things that you're going to leave. Everything else comes off. Then you're going to take your 4-in-1, you're going to solder that thing up. You got power lead coming from the XT60 going to the 4-in-1. The 4-in-1 is actually fully powering, and once you solder your motors onto the 4-in-1, then your motors are good, everything's good. The flight controller does not have power. It usually gets power through these cables, but in this case, it does not. So you actually have to power the flight controller from the 4-in-1. So you have to solder on something like that, a little jumper going to the power leads on the 4-in-1. Then, out of the FC, and then out of the FC, you have these cables that are running one to the PDB, so that you can get telemetry and you can power your flight controller, power your camera and your video transmitter, and then you have another running out and going to the 4-in-1 so that you can actually, control the 4-in-1. And again, those are PDB out of the flight controller goes to the 4-in-1, which there's only one plug on there, and I used this little small thing that came with the Mr. Steele PDB, a little small cable. And then the one that comes out of serial 1 on the flight controller itself goes to port 2 on the Mr. Steele PDB. And then, you kind of figure out the standoff situation. And I actually mounted the 4-in-1 in a weird way. I didn't mount it the way that it was originally intended to be mounted. I think it's like turn 90 degrees and inverted. I'll figure out what that is and show you. But yeah, that's kind of how it's set up. And yeah, the main benefit of this is you actually don't have to run capacitors, and it's a little bit quicker of a build. This build actually takes a lot less time to build from scratch than it does to do for individual ESCs. Anyways, I wanted to talk to you lastly, but this is actually very important as well. So I have noticed between the two different builds that the PIDs are slightly different, and mainly not the total PID situation, but mainly the yaw P. For example, just talking in general, tuning on 6S. 6S is giving you a lot more torque, and it's also giving you a lot more voltage to deal with as far as your electronics are concerned. So I've actually gotten a lot of questions recently through private emails and DMs on Instagram and messages on Facebook, comments on YouTube. People are questioning like, hey, I'm running your motors, I'm running stock PIDs on Betaflight or whatever. Motors are getting really hot. Why is this? And stock PIDs are not going to work for the most part when you're talking about running 6-cell, because stock PIDs change with your cell count and your motor count, but they work really well with 4S, maybe 5S, and I'm sure in some instances they do work well with 6S, but for the most part, PIDs and stock are generally geared towards 4S as a whole. And why that is just because 4S has been a standard for so long. Stock PID, something getting out of the box and be able to run something out of the box, is going to be using the most common whatever setup out there, and that is usually 4S with roughly a 2300, 2500 kV motor on a pitch prop that's between 3 and 5 pitch. On a 5-inch prop, that is kind of the standard. Now, obviously, stock PIDs will work on 6-inch motors and 6-inch props with lower kV, but when you talk about running a 6S setup and you're talking about running something that's the equivalent of like a 25 or 2700 kV motor on 4S, you're talking about running 1700 roughly on 6S, then all of this stuff actually, it seems like it doesn't change because you're running something that's equivalent to a 4S 2600 kV when you're running 6S on 1700 kV. I know there's a lot of numbers, so bear with me. But when you run something equivalent like that, as far as RPM is concerned, you would think it would be similar as far as stock PIDs and being able to use them. But from my personal findings, and again, all of this is my personal opinion, so don't go out and quote me on the world and say, so Steele said this is the only thing that matters, and this is the end-all be-all of all quads. Don't take that. This is like, learning from my personal experience. When I made a 6S setup and I put in the stock PIDs, I actually was running my 4S PIDs, which are pretty high. And I know there have been some videos recently that say PIDs don't matter. I am a true advocate for believing that PIDs do matter. For most people, they don't, but for someone that wants to get the quad feeling the exact way that they want it to feel, which again, not everybody can decipher what that is. It's kind of like giving somebody a race car and saying, hey, set up the suspension how you want it. 99% of the people out there are probably not going to be able to set up the suspension how they want it. They're just going to say, I want it stiff, and I want it to handle well. Well, quads are the same way. Most people are not going to notice, but a lot of people that are finely tuned and want something specific are going to be able to notice, and adjusting PIDs are going to help them gain what they want out of the quad's flying characteristics. But like I was saying, when you're doing something that's equivalent as far as putting a 4S setup and a 6S setup next to each other, 6S has a lot more torque. So when you're talking about higher voltage and you're talking about torque, it kind of exponentially like both of them go up. You get more torque, you get more response with higher voltage. That increased response and that increased torque in the motors actually causes you to be able to lower the PIDs to get them to be happy. When you're talking about PIDs being too high usually results in high-pitched oscillations, and also high-pitched oscillations result in heat because these things are battering back and forth, fighting each other, and that causes the motors to heat up because they're constantly speeding up and slowing down really quickly. And when you're talking about adding heat, that can eventually, I had a dude recently say, hey, I smell enamel coming off the motors, and what that is actually all of these motors are wound with copper wire coated in enamel, so that when you're talking about phases, there's 3 phases going into these motors. All of these things are wound on top of each other. If there was no isolation barrier between these phases, then they would just short out and catch on fire. But they have an enamel coating, and when they get hot, you can smell enamel coming from the motors. Now, this is not a good smell to smell, but it's not something that's out of the ordinary. It's kind of like, smelling a race car and being like, oh, it smells like oil. Well, maybe the pistons haven't heated up yet, and there's some blow-by going through, or some blow-by going past the piston rings and being burned in the combustion chamber until the engine gets hot. So this is kind of the same situation. However, it's not ideal if you're smelling enamel every time you go fly, but baking the motors in is not uncommon. I've found on 6S, like sometimes they just, like when they're brand new, they're gonna bake in a little bit because you're running such a high voltage and such a high torque number as far as like torque and responsiveness in the quad. If you want it to feel a certain way, you kind of have to give and take. You have to take away from the, I guess reliability, even though I haven't had any reliability issues, but you're burning a little bit of the enamel that comes on it, and you're getting that responsiveness that you want. You could lower the Ps to an extent where it would not burn any enamel, but then the quad wouldn't feel the way that I personally wanted it to feel, which was more responsive than the 6S or the 4S setups that I had been flying in the past. Now, with all that being said, what are ideal PIDs? I will throw up some PIDs here on the screen. I have done a video previously about PIDs on 6S and how they differ from 4S. Again, they are lower as far as the Ps are concerned. Sometimes the Is can be reduced as well, but Ds pretty much run the same. I have adjusted the rates slightly to accommodate different characteristics with that added torque and that added responsiveness, but you are talking about lowering the Ps in general pretty significantly, if not half, maybe more than half. Now, the one thing that I have noticed that I do need to specify with these two setups, when you're talking about an individual ESC setup, I have noticed that you can run a higher yaw P, or that it is needed to run a higher yaw P to get the same responsiveness out of this quad that I want, versus running a 4-in-1 setup. You don't have to run as high of a yaw P. I don't know why that is. I'm guessing it's probably because there is a lower latency of time between ESCs, because they are all together and they're not having to travel that extra inch. I know that seems negligible, but this is just, again, personal experience. You're talking about a 4-in-1, everything's all conjoined into one PDB. You're running through traces instead of running through wires. You're not having to transition from one conductive material to the other. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but I have personally found it to be that if you run the same PIDs from the 4 individual ESC setup on the 4-in-1 setup, it will get very hot and you will start to smell enamel. So lowering the yaw P on the enamel, or lowering the yaw P on the 4-in-1 setup, seems to be the option to make this fly the way that I want it to fly. And I will tell you right now that this setup feels a little bit more responsive than that setup, and it's subtle. Again, we're talking about like literally splitting hairs with subtlety, but it is a tiny bit more responsive, and I do think it just has to do with everything being closer together and there not having to be as much travel between the two, and maybe talking back and forth feedback between ESCs is a little bit quicker when you're talking about something that is literally running through one unified PDB style 4-in-1 ESC. Or PCB instead of PDB, sorry. One unified PCB of ESCs rather than 4 individual PCBs. So again, that is kind of the end result of my findings with 6S and the setups that I have found to be flying reliable. I do kind of like fly this one more just because it's my beater. So you probably see me having this quad, and these are not 2350 kV motors. These are actually prototypes, so that's why the bottom is white. So please don't think that you can put 2345 silk motors with the stout bells, and all of a sudden it's able to run 6S. You do need to lower the kV. I'm not saying it's impossible, but again, we're talking about something that you want reliability out of and you want it to be able to be tuned. It's very much like running a high compression engine and trying to throw boost at it. That's why most boosted engines in the world, as far as cars are concerned, run low boost, because it's a little bit more controllable to control combustion in a lower compression engine as far as compression ratio when you're talking about adding forced induction. I don't even know if people in my channel understand cars, but I use that reference. I use references a lot as far as cars are concerned. And again, running 6S on a high kV setup is exactly like running boost through a really high compression engine. It's extremely difficult to control reliably. So, you know, it can be done, but as reliability your main goal? Is tunability your main goal? Are you okay with oscillations all the time? Is that fine? Are you not running a GoPro? Do you not care about HD footage? For me personally, I do care about HD footage, and I want something that's reliable, gets a longer flight time, and also is fairly consistent all the time as far as being able to have no vibrations in the HD video. So I could talk for hours about my setup and why I prefer the things that I do. People comment all the time and say, you're running outdated gear, blah, blah, blah. You know, it does what I need it to do. This frame is 3 years old. I'm still flying the Alien. I have no problems with it. I am working on some new stuff, but again, I think this setup right now it's always has done exactly what I wanted it to do, and I don't think that there is something hindering me from doing anything that I need to do as far as a setup and gear is concerned. It's reliable. It does everything that I want it to do. It feels exactly the way that I want it to do, and I can literally not fly for months and then pick it up and fly it again, and it's exactly what I remember, and I don't have to relearn anything. And that's kind of the mentality that I've taken with everything in life. You find something that works, you stick with it, you get better at it because you understand how it reacts and how it responds to your inputs. Now, whether or not you agree with that, that is perfectly a personal opinion. So feel free to comment and have a good time in the comment section. In what would be the word? I condone positive comments, and I do not condone negative comments, and I am kind of monitoring stuff these days. So please be happy. Everyone have a good time. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you want to, you can check out the description below here, and there will be all kinds of links to this gear if you're curious to make any kind of adjustments to your current rig, or if you're new to the industry or new to the hobby and you want to go and find something that is reliable and works for you. Can't recommend this setup enough, and I'm not just saying that to sell you gear. I'm saying that because you will have a good experience with this gear, and from thousands of other people, thousands of testimonies of people commenting and sending me messages saying this setup just works, man. I can't thank you enough for something that literally just worked out of the box. So thank you again. Have a good day. I'm gonna Jack Sparrow over here somewhere.